I'm being filmed here in London, where studies were done in the 19th century of 20 households having to share one fire to cook on. How can you feed yourself adequately in those sort of material conditions? The 20th century was about trying to improve the material conditions, the infrastructure for health. In the book, I co-wrote with my friend and colleague Jeff Rayner, Ecological Public Health. We looked at the long-term public health problem. What is public health? And our conclusion, reviewing a whole number of changes in the world over the last 250 years, industrial capitalism, the modern era, we concluded that public health is today exactly what it was in the past. It's about shaping the conditions for good health. Now, when it comes to diet, what's a good diet? I'm Europe's only professor of food policy. I wish there were more. I'm old. We run a master's at my university. They're popping up of brilliant young people now exploring these problems. But what's a good diet? Well, we know what the nutritionists say. But what's a good diet for health and the environment? Is it the same in London as in Lagos or Lusaka? What's a sustainable diet in Mumbai, Bombay, where I lived as a child? Is it the same as in Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo? This is now a major issue for 21st century food policy. Part of the crisis of food policy is not just poor leadership, lack of a new framework, although I'm optimistic. I think that's beginning to emerge. It's not bedded down, it's not statutory, it's not totally agreed, but the need for it and the case for it and the misty shape of it is beginning to emerge. But what's a sustainable diet is now an absolutely critical issue for us to get clear on. In the second half of the 20th century, the architects of productionism, the policy approach that said produce more food, prices will come down as long as we distribute it okay and sort out waste on and near the farms, everything will get better and public health will improve. That's progress. It's a beautiful, simple, elegant, and to some extent successful policy model. Those architects were often actually public health people. John Boyd Orr, the first Director General of the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. I see his statue every time I go into the entrance of the headquarters of the FAO in Rome. There he is, smoking a pipe. He was a doctor. They didn't understand the epidemiology of tobacco then. Their view was that public health nutrition's demand of agriculture was to produce more food, get protein, get calories, get what they call the protective foods, vegetables, green vegetables. They understood about vegetables. Vitamins had been discovered. Garland Hopkins got the Nobel Prize for vitamins in 1928. Their vision was essentially about producing more and making it available. But by the 1970s, Ancel Keys and the Seven Nations study had emerged, showing very strange things. Richer societies didn't have better diets. Ancel Keys and other scientists, American scientists in his case, were beginning to show heart disease. They were beginning to show that rich societies, Britain, the United States, had worse diets for public health than Japan or Greece. Actually, Ancel Keys' study was on Crete. And the Cretan diet They took fantastic amount of exercise, by the way. It's not all just about diet. It's how we live. Do we burn that food that we eat? The Cretan diet was heavily plant-based. And if they ate meat, it was a sheep that had run up and down mountains. If you go to Crete, it's mountainous. They ate lots of herbs. They ate a very diverse diet. But the 1970s nutritionists were suddenly realizing that the impact of diet was not just one where nutrition advice could be just eat more. The 1930s analysis. And at the same time, the environmental data is coming out saying, but food's causing this damage to the environment. What's a good diet for biodiversity? Well, you could say, let me go to a hypermarket. Look, there's hundreds of different fruits and vegetables from all over the world there. But what's the environmental footprint? What's the carbon of transporting it? Well, actually, most of the carbon tends to be on and near the farm or in cooking. We now have lots of science in the 21st century that is beginning to analyze diet through a more complicated set of lenses. Talking calories ain't enough. Some people argue, well, calories and carbon go side by side. High-calorie diets are high-carbon diets, therefore climate change involved. A lot of attention now focuses on meat and dairy. Meat and dairy, which is culturally been seen eating more of, is a cultural good. It's a sign of progress. Meat that used to be feast day food is everyday food. At one point in Britain, you could buy 3 chickens for £5. €7. This is unbelievable. Coming from Thailand or Brazil all the way here. This is astonishing. What's a good diet? This is still a huge question. But the key thing is nutrition can't be left to sort this out. It's got to have other scientists and other sciences and other bodies of knowledge to help articulate what that is. And I'm not arguing, by the way, that scientists should tell us what to eat. The job of science, the job of academics, is to help hold the mirror up and say, is this what you want? Because that's what's happening at the moment. If the challenge is sustainable diets, what's the policy route into this? Almost every country on the planet that I can see and have been able to look at issues some sort of official guidelines, nutrition guidelines. They're often known as dietary guidelines or food-based dietary guidelines. There's an argument about whether or not those should be set by nutrients, breaking down protein, calories, well, not protein, but calories, salt, etc., giving them down even to micronutrients, or whether it's better to give those guidelines in food terms. So the United States has the dietary guidelines for Americans, revised every 5 years. In Europe, we went through a rather lugubrious and very fractious process of setting a Euro diet in 2001. In Britain, we have dietary guidelines set and put through the Food Standards Agency. The Netherlands, likewise. Most countries have systems like that. In Brazil, the same. In India, the same. China, the same. How do we make these sustainable dietary guidelines? Well, firstly, nutritionists aren't very happy about that. So there's actually an internecine fight going on. Nutritionists say, don't muddy these waters, we've got enough trouble. We've been trying to get these to be taken seriously for years. We've been giving the 5-a-day messages, eat this, eat that, cut back on meat and dairy, etc. Now you're coming along and saying, well, we've got to have the environment. We've got to take cultural differences and seasonality and local and identity issues seriously. Don't complicate it. It's a good argument, but I think ultimately wrong. The Sustainable Dietary Guidelines approach says, well, let's try and piece this together. Without a doubt, the best thing that happened in this respect from the commodity crisis of 2007-8 was that some of the rich countries started thinking about this more seriously. Across Northern Europe, it was remarkable. It was actually very nice to see it. In Britain, in Germany, which had been ahead of the game, I'll come to that in a moment, in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in Italy, Southern Europe, processes began to start saying, well, okay, what should we have by ways of sustainable dietary guidelines? And Sweden really set the benchmark. Sweden's food it's Environmental Protection Agency and its National Food Administration, the two relevant bodies, worked for 2 years to create dietary advice for environmentally conscious consumers. And being good Europeans, they sent this carefully crafted document that said things like, eat seasonally, if you can. It has a lower carbon footprint. If I eat a strawberry in the middle of winter from Britain, it will have, without doubt, been under a greenhouse, using energy to burn it, to create it. Actually, lower carbon, lower footprint to have it grown in open air in Spain in midwinter. And even despite trucking it 1,000 miles, its carbon footprint will be lower. But to eat fruit in season is actually the optimum. Eat sustainably sourced fish. If everyone ate rare fish, the seas are empty. The Swedish advice was remarkable. They sent it to the European Commission, to the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, and said, we want to make this our advice. Well, then a lot of skullduggery went on. Still not entirely clear what's happened. We've got people looking at it, but almost certainly pressure from big meat companies in America through to Poland, a European Union member by then, cast doubt on whether this was within European law. Was it infringing the single market? That food should be freely tradable between and within all 27 member states. So if Sweden was saying eat locally, eat seasonally, was that being a trade barrier to food coming from Italy or Spain? So Sweden withdrew it. Well, this, I think, was a tragedy. This was crazy. This was a narrow view of economics determining sustainable diets. But at the same time, the British had begun to work. The British produced work that said, actually, the good news is a healthier diet, eating less meat, less dairy, also lowers environmental impact. So it's not just a situation of tensions between environment and health. There is win-win. But nonetheless, when you go into more detail, there are still some difficulties. Do I eat fish? Is the big one. Do I eat fish? If I eat 2 portions of fish, one of which is oily, the British advice, and the whole world of 7 billion people did that, mackerel, herring and sardines are gone within a few years. The seas are already in crisis, overfished and distorted. Fish is a really tricky one. Meat and dairy, the cultural signals, even in India, primarily vegetarian economy and diet. It's got the biggest and fastest growing dairy herd on the planet. And the cows are major emitters of methane, 24 times more powerful as a climate change gas than CO2. Maybe instead of having global nutrition advice, we're going to have to bio-regionalize dietary advice. That's what the Swedish test, if you like, really points to. Back in 1992, the UN system hosted, it was the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the World Health Organization, the WHO, two key parts of the UN system. They hosted, the UN hosted an international conference on nutrition, ICN, International Conference on Nutrition. That tried to encapsulate the growing concern about consumption and diet and public health nutrition. Largely, it was framed around the underconsumption problem. It was dominated by the hunger story rather than the malconsumption, overconsumption, and underconsumption story, what I think is the new picture. It took 22 years before the UN system did a recall, known as ICN2, International Conference on Nutrition number 2, held not 20 years later, but 22 years later, in 2014. Now, the year 1992 is significant because ICN number 1 was in the same year as the Rio Conference, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which was the outcome of the Brundtland Report, to some extent, the World Commission on Environment and Development, where Brundtland and her commission said the world's economy must aim towards everything, but in our case we're talking about food, a food system which is good for the economy, good for the environment, good for society. What I think, and many people think, ICN2 should have done was pick up on all the data, all the complexity, all the tensions, all the problems that had emerged since 1992. The data on which had got stronger and stronger, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, commissions on water, on land use, huge Millennium Ecosystems Assessment, studying all the world's ecosystems, came out in 2005. Surely ICN2 would have taken those on board. I smiled, but I was in tears. It did nothing of the kind. A bit of rhetoric about it, but nothing seriously said, what is a good diet for the 21st century? Good for health, good for the environment, and living within our means. Planning for a world of 9 billion people. The assumption was still essentially productionist. The big problem is hunger. Hunger is a huge problem. 0.9 billion people are malnourished, but 1.4 or 1.5 billion people, i.e. much more, are overweight and obese, and that is growing. And 2 billion people are malconsuming, iodine deficiencies, things that aren't about taste, but about minerals in food and things. The world ought to have got pointers towards sustainable diets at ICN2. It didn't. Many of us pushing for that, big preparatory conferences hosted at FAO. I co-chaired a 3-day working party in a big science conference hosted by the FAO and Biodiversity International, one of the consultative group of international agricultural research, one of the UN-affiliated big agricultural research bodies looking at biodiversity, in Rome in 2000. We articulated the need and the case and the broad parameters of sustainable diets and said we now need to get into more detail. Countries need to engage with this. We can't expect the food industry to produce food which is good for diet, health, the planet, society, if we don't give them guidelines. What's the framework of a good food system must include diet, surely. I get heated. And yet we're not getting that. And yet, as we saw in the example of Sweden, the most articulate attempt to do this It was beaten back by vested interest from the meat and dairy industry. The same happened, by the way, in Australia. The Australians, in the revision of their dietary guidelines, started taking it very seriously. People on the committee said we must factor environment into this. Beaten back by the Australian meat industry. And the politicians backed it. Australia's a meat and dairy exporter. We're talking power politics in something that really ought to be something that is democratically available and democratically just. It makes no sense to have a world where the diet of even low-income people in a rich country like the United States do not get advice on what a sustainable diet is. Do I eat fish? Yes or no? It's a crunch issue. Do I eat meat? It's not yes or no, but how much? Produced how? If I have a broiler chicken produced in a factory farm, it has a short life. It's a welfare issue. The animal welfarists, and I share this view, think it's disgraceful. But it's being fed grain. It's converting something that humans can eat to produce an animal in captivity to then give us something that we like because we think meat is nice. It's a cultural indicator. We must sort this mess out. What's a good diet? And the system of governance is not helping us. Or not enough. But the good news, it's tiptoeing in there. When I was a government commissioner in Britain, I hammered the Food Standards Agency, very politely, of saying, I will not be happy with you as a commissioner on sustainable development until you've sorted out, do I eat fish, yes or no? To be fair, the British government then, 2009-10, set up a working party across Northern Europe, beginning to share this issue. Yeah, we've got to sort this out, actually. All of that stopped. It was driven back. But to be fair, the Food Standards Agency did start modifying on its website, said, please eat sustainable fish. But that's still not sorting it out. It's not sorting out the food system, not sorting out the fisheries system to make sure that that's only what we get. It's being left to consumer choice, the neoliberal market model again. I don't want some nanny corporation telling me what to eat, because that's what's happening at the moment. Their marketing dominates our cultural mores. I think the crisis of sustainable diets isn't one just of governments and experts getting together. It's a crisis actually for us, consumers. Do I know what a sustainable diet is? The answer is yes, we now know the broad criteria by which to judge it. Is that advice being given to me supported by whoever? The answer is no. We have a plethora, many attempts to do it. Vegans say, well, that's the answer. Well, is it soya? Is soya chopping down the Amazon the answer to a sustainable diet? Not so sure. I don't know, what do we do with the uplands in a country like Britain? In India, a Hindu-dominated country with a huge dairy industry, but not eating the meat. This is complicated, but has to be sorted out. This is a crisis for us and our conception of what a good diet is. When I ask myself about what do I eat, let alone sort of national guidelines or what's good for the world, I gave up meat, actually. I used to be a beef farmer, sheep. I've killed most animals. I've bred them. But I gave up meat in Britain for a very different reason, actually. It was over mad cow disease. I was so angry about how it was handled so badly. It's a textbook of what not to do in a food policy world. But I've stayed not eating meat, but I eat dairy. So indirectly I'm eating meat. Essentially, I think a good diet is one which is plant-based. On that, the science agrees, both the environment and public health nutrition. The more plants we eat, the better. But I'm interested in biodiversity, actually. I think biodiversity is one of the really tricky issues. When I go around a hypermarket in the United States or a big Carrefour in France or a vast Tesco cathedral in Britain, to give some examples, I could say to myself, well, here's biodiversity. Isn't this wonderful? Look at this. Hundreds of plants, fresh. They're all put at the beginning to remind you that it's a shop, because after that, everything's packaged and tinned and signed, sealed and delivered. So is that the way forward, that we just eat plants? Well, the answer is no. That's not quite what sustainable diets is getting us to think about. It's getting us to think of the nature of production. How's it being produced? Is that spinach that I think is great produced in a 100-hectare block, sprayed endlessly, and really is hermetically sealed but on the land? Is that the same thing as having spinach grown alongside and in between other crops that I also want to eat? I think the principle is moving towards getting biodiversity in the field and through to my stomach. I think that's a principle that's emerging. Sustainable diet isn't just me, the consumer, but is about signals going back through the food supply chain. And we have to do more work, actually, on these things. But the big picture about carbon and climate change and calories is clear. The rich world overconsumes. The most important thing to meet a sustainable diet, thinking, that I can do is to eat less and to cut down on meat and dairy in particular, and preferably give them up, actually. Although that then sends really strange signals. I'm an ex-Northern English farmer. On the moors of the north of England where I farmed, what do? They're sheep farms. Not sheep farms as in Australia, but they're maintaining the moorlands. Well, you can argue, get rid of the sheep and grow trees. That would be much better for climate change. That is actually what that terrain was 4,000 years ago. We think of the beauty of the moors and the mountains, as has happened in Greece, where the goats ate the trees, the sheep ate the land in countries like Britain. So thinking landscape is part of eating a sustainable diet. Some of this picture is win-win. I repeat, if I eat less meat and dairy, that's better for carbon and better for health. Some of it is tricky. I repeat, fish, do I eat it? Yes, say the nutritionists. No, say the environmentalists. Or only, please, sustainably sourced. But what is that? And if 6-7 billion people eat that, let alone 9 billion, they're pretty certainly wiped out. So where are we going to get our omega-3s and omega-4s, 6s from? Plants, seaweeds. We need to rethink, actually, where we get our nutrients from and to translate that into a diet that we like. There's no point force-feeding us nutrients. Some companies would love that. They'll say, we'll do it. This will be the new techno-wizardry. Indeed, some people are working on that. There was a wonderful sort of account of this new world, this new techno-wizard world, given in the Financial Times in 2014, if you want to look for it. This is a world where you have an egg-free mayonnaise produced from plants. This is a world where new generations of processing funded by venture capitalists will say, look, eat me. I'm your answer to a sustainable diet. So this is an open question. There are different approaches to what a sustainable diet, not about the nutrients, but about how we get it. And the point that I'm raising here is, although the science is becoming clearer about nutrients and ecosystems, nutrients and over, mal and under consumption, the method of getting the sustainable diet is problematic. That's a political issue, as it always is. I would say that. I'm a professor of food policy. And I don't mean politics in the sense of party politics, necessarily. Sometimes it's that. I mean it's about who controls that, who controls our ideas, who controls our culture. The 20th century has essentially been a century of deracination. It separated us from our roots. I'm using the Latin word, deracinate. It's separating us from our roots. Culture has broken away from religion. There are many people who follow religious diets, but diet has been secularized even for people who are following religious rules. Companies have taken more control. Consumerism has taken over what we want. And the evidence about sustainable diets is we have to rein that back, to eat less in the rich countries and the poor countries eat more. And the policy package that I think fits that is known as contract to converge. This is a model that was developed for climate change. I think it fits public health nutrition perfectly. Contract in the sense of the rich countries eat less, for the poor countries to eat more, and converge towards a more sustainable diet. And that the policy architecture is not in place yet to deliver. But there is now a movement to do that, a movement around sustainable development goals, coupling with sustainable dietary guidelines, what I call SDG squared. And I think that's the way to go. So I'm an optimist. I think we're in a process of democratic experimentation. One of my favorite civil society groups, the Fife Diet, a husband and wife and a family and some of their friends got together in the early 2000s and said, we must live within our locality. Everyone thought they were going to starve to death. They were in the north of Scotland, middle of Scotland, arguably, but to southerners like me, north. They got thinner. They rebuilt local farming and growing. It grew to 1,000 more, 6,000 people subscribing to this view. This is wonderful. People are experimenting. In Vancouver, another, the Vancouver 100-mile diet. There are civil societies beginning to experiment with sustainable diets, sending signals back. But I don't think any of this will change unless we get help at the national and international level. I would say that. I'm an academic on food policy. But the good news is I think that's beginning to bubble up too. The Swedish experiment, the Netherlands experiment, the British experiment. These are early signs of the structural change for sustainable dietary guidelines. That's the way to go.